welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica from Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast, and my wonderful co-host who I am sitting right next to is
Jen. Hi, it's so nice to be here.
Hi, Jen. How are you? And we are basically jumping out of our seats because we are so excited about our guest today. We spoke to you last year for Camp Damascus, which is one of my favorite books of all time now.
Yes,
I tell everybody. But until this one, because then I started reading this one and I was like, oh no, this is going to be a hard battle of the Tinglers. So Chuck, welcome.
What a kind, that is, I think the kindest thing, I think every artist wants their new thing to be their biggest and best. And that is often hard to do. It doesn't always work that way where every movie is better than the last, or every album is better, every book is, and that is a high compliment indeed to think, oh, you fell in love with the first book and now are entering a romance will they won't they love triangle with Camp Damascus and Bury Your Gays right now.
Yes, it is. Both books are so lovely, and something that I really love about both is that they are so different in terms of setting and characters and all of the context, but thematically they're so united, and they both have such a really indomitable positive spirit in a lot of ways.
Yeah. They're just very, I don't want to say it's like candy. They go down smooth and sweet, and they're awesome. And
but also if candy were therapy too.
If candy were therapy, your writing, it's addicting. I mean,
thank you.
Yes, you wrote one banger, and here's another really good one. I mean, we both have a ton of different questions. Did you want to start us off, Jen?
Oh, sure.
Go for
it. So my first question is about choosing this setting and not just where, but when. It feels so prescient in terms of not just depicting Hollywood, but depicting a lot of the debates that are sort of we associate with Hollywood, like with AI and with the strikes and with sort of like corporate monoculture. So I'm really curious, how long were you writing and editing this for? Because it feels like so up to the minute relevant,
Oh yes, this is you've already stumbled upon something so fascinating about this book, which is that believe it or not, I wrote this around the same time as Camp Damascus, basically right after. And when I was writing it, for the listeners who don't know, this comes up in the first chapter, so it's not a spoiler. But what's going on is that in Hollywood, the very first entirely AI performance is up for best picture, or not best picture, best actor. And so it's a big deal in Hollywood, and that's kind of the backdrop for what's going on. And I actually wrote this at a time when I thought, oh, I'm going to have to go back and maybe edit this because no one's gonna go there with me. No one's going to buy that this is possible. And I just, the whole thing was just, I was really worried that it was a little bit kind of too abstract and too ahead with the technology part of it. And then in the 2 years that it took for the book to come out, everything changed and the conversation entirely changed. But it is kind of, there's that meme about The Simpsons predicting these world events. This book really feels like it's almost unbelievable that it was written before all this stuff happened, but it really was. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, absolutely. It really did feel just so, I mean, I have to use the term ripped from the headlines. And it really just got you right into the moment because this book is set in 2025. So why did you choose 2025?
Oh, well, yes, 2025. Honestly, that is part of me thinking it's kind of a parallel, it's definitely a parallel timeline. I think that comes up in the first chapter where we have the performance in question I mentioned is from superstar actor Chris Oak, who is named after an actor on this timeline that a lot of buckaroos think has something to do with myself. It's a very, there's some meta narratives going on, but there is no Chris Oak on this timeline. We have Chris Pine, and so there's certain events that happen that I just kind of wanted to make it seem like a parallel reality that is modern, not futuristic in a way of an unrelatable sort of sci-fi kind of space travel type thing or a distant future, but essentially a future that is right around the corner. And it'll be interesting how the book ages. I did think about this kind of a lot. I thought, 2025, the majority of buckaroos read a book when it comes out, unless it becomes dang Harry or something. It's generally around the time it comes out. And I just thought, gosh, wow, I wonder how this is going to be looked at. So essentially that date was chosen to be modern. I guess the summary is right around the corner. It should feel like this is absolutely what will happen next. It could be tomorrow, it could be the next month, it could be the next year, but it is just the day that's coming up while we're reading it. It's what's right around the corner, which I guess is kind of a horror thing, in itself.
I'm very glad that you brought up the meta elements, because something that I loved about it is that Bury Your Gays is itself a work of queer horror that is like really beautiful and really gripping. It's also an examination of queer horror and its roots. And I think the way that we develop relationships to it. And I think there's like this really lovely resonance that it came out around the same time as I saw the TV Glow, which is like another queer piece of horror that explores our relationships to media and how they aid us in our self-discovery. And so that's leading me to a question of, is the media that you portray, like all of these properties that both Misha had a hand in creating and the ones that Misha remembers from childhood, were those shaped by the sort of the media that you feel like shaped you or influenced you?
Yes. Well, first of all, incredible you brought this up, because I saw the TV Go last night. And really loved it, was blown away. And I did notice when I was watching it, I thought, gosh, there's some really interesting similarities to Bury Your Gays. I think that, Bury Your Gays is about a lot of things, and it's about a lot of current things, but it's also about how what's happening right now relates to nostalgia. And it relates to the things that kind of make us, specifically the media that makes us. And I think it's lifting up fandom and kind of saying, creation is this cycle. We go through these things as we're growing up, whether it's good times or trauma or all these things, and that human creation is the synthesis of that then someone else will kind of witness. And it's this big, beautiful cycle that is basically what humanity is. It's what art is. It's a big scope thing to talk about, but it is really what the book is. And I absolutely think I Saw the TV Glow is also tapping into that, specifically in the nostalgia sense. To answer your more direct part of the question, yes, I think, if I didn't have experience with these different forms of media and kind of notice the patterns in them, I don't think I would be able to kind of craft the alternate timeline version for Bury Your Gays. I mean, I've heard it called the spooky cops shows, but that is very much what I grew up on of, X-Files. X-Files was actually the big one for me. I think the references in Bury Your Gays are much more like supernatural. And what's actually funny is that I know, I didn't watch Fringe, but I know that it has to do with alternate timelines. So I always think I would probably really like that one. But and also actually Buffy does kind of fall into this category a little bit. There's this tradition of that type of procedural that brought in a supernatural element that I think is really nostalgic for a certain generation, whether it's like the very old version of that, which there's probably examples before, but I would say the older one in my mind is the X-Files, and then the later ones. But anyone who kind of entered this zone, I think, has these very specific feelings about that type of show that this really taps into.
Yeah, we were actually just talking about that sort of when we were going over it. And Buffy did come up because I mean the book is called Bury Your Gays, and Buffy very famously does that.
Yes.
With Tara, who I did wonder, is Tara in your book a nod to Tara in Buffy?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the naming, the way, when I conceptualized this book, I kind of thought I want this to be not only kind of a love letter to fandom, but a sort of like a version of these characters, giving them another life. And granted, they don't really have anything to do with, the character traits of Tara in Buffy are not the character traits of Tara in Bury Your Gays, but there is a sort of like maybe you could think of it like a reincarnation of these characters, of sort of like giving a second chance. So Tara is that Misha, obviously a reference to Supernatural, and then actually ones that are a little harder to get are, you have Zeke, who is Misha's boyfriend, is actually a reference to Lost. There's a character, Mr. Friendly on Lost, who is one of my favorite versions of just a really funny Bury Your Gays, because spoilers if you're gonna watch Lost. I know this show's decades old now, but Mr. Friendly dies. Zeke, is Sawyer calls him, and then in the flashback we find out that he's gay after he's dead. And so I've always joked that that's the most Bury Your Gays you can get, because it's literally not right before dying. It is like after death. They come out. So it's a bunch of those. There's also there's actually a reference to Skins in the UK, has an example of that there's a reference to, and then a show called The 100. So there's actually a lot just all over the book. There's actually multiple supernatural references for burying. There's just, the whole thing is kind of this collection of like Easter eggs that I kind of wanted to do to sort of just feel like I'm giving these characters like a second chance almost.
Yeah, it really is lovely to see, the media of the 90s that often like really shaped me too. I was a huge X-Files person. And this is something that I am really interested in when I think about nostalgia, is that it can be really therapeutic, or it can be really dissociative and avoidant, and sort of like actually blocking you from engaging with reality or with yourself. And
Yes.
so much of it like dances that line, and how that relates to sort of Misha's sort of ambiguous half out of the closet, half in the closet. And, do we also bury our gays within ourselves when we don't admit who we are to the public? Like, that was not really a question. It was a series of observations.
Oh no, it's a great observation, because I think I Saw the TV Glow is also very much about that. That's kind of the point of it. For me, I have talked about a lot how I do write message first. So there was clearly a message I wanted to send, but that specific aspect, and the reason that this book is so personal, is because it actually really truly is the story of me relating to my own art. As an autistic buckaroo who can pass very, very well as neurotypical, there's many that don't know that I am autistic when I'm outside of this pink bag over my head. I know the listeners probably can't see, but I am wearing a pink bag, and my identity is hidden in many ways. But without this, I can neurotypically mask very well, and also as a bisexual buckaroo in a hetero presenting relationship as well. I my bisexuality is just, all these things are very hidden. So for me, I never felt like I was in the closet, because I always had this sort of attitude of, well, you didn't ask. And if you did, sure, I would say so. But, no one asks that, So really, I kind of realized that when I put on this pink mask and I create all this art that is very, very queer art, essentially everyone in my life that kind of knows my legal name or knows me without this mask, kind of realized, our bud is probably queer. And actually, that's kind of how I came out, by never really coming out, but just kind of creating all this queer art. But that kind of gave me a lot of inner thoughts. I had to kind of really wrestle with, well, what does that mean? Is that fair? Is that, just, there's so much kind of baggage that goes along with essentially being out in your art, but not, in your personal life, or at least kind of half in, half out. And specifically, actually, there was a big kind of event that I did, where I invited a bunch of family to come see, and they didn't know that it was a Chuck event. And I said, "Oh, come see me perform." And then they did, and realized, oh, okay, I've made this connection. And afterwards, I remember talking to my dang manager and saying, "I didn't even think about this, but that's a heck of a way to come out." And so, it kind of, that event, and kind of, there's some things in Barrier Gays where there's like a big event where you can kind of, instead of being half in, half out, you can really proclaim it. So everything in this book is very much, it is almost an entire mirror of my life and my process with that. That's why it's so personal, actually. So it's an interesting book like that. It's definitely the most personal thing I have ever written.
I mean, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I did say to Jen before we started recording how much I did appreciate that you had a bisexual man in a main role as well with Zeke. I remember, first of all, I myself am bi, yeah, and my thing was, I hadn't been like open about it until probably a few years ago, but like my joke was always like, well, the closet door's open. If you know what's inside, you see, you get it,
Yes, yes, you can peer inside, and those who know what they're looking for have noticed the trinkets laying around, the bisexual paraphernalia that I keep stored in there.
100%. But I do recall, especially bisexual men, like when I was a kid and a teenager, and I was doing all of those sex ed classes post the AIDS epidemic, or during the the late period of the AIDS epidemic, it was like there were these standards, like bisexuals are, like confused, or, they're promiscuous. But specifically, I remember a video that we watched. It was either in 5th or 6th grade, where these women were all talking about, possibly contracting AIDS. And this one woman's like, "Oh, well, I have a friend who dated a bisexual, and that's how she got it, a bisexual man." And it was just the most toxic thing. Specifically, that this was enemy number one. Like, he masquerades as a guy, but that you want to date, but he's also dating guys, which means he's clearly going. I mean, really, it was just so horrific that every time I think about it, I'm like, that's just awful. So I really appreciate Zeke being a bisexual man in this story.
Yes, well, the for a very long time, and probably still, this stereotype still definitely holds. It was the stereotype was a bisexual woman kind of gets the side eye and saying, well, you're really straight. And then a bisexual man kind of gets the side eye and they say, oh, well, you're really gay. It is kind of, for some reason, that has just forever permeated everything. So yeah, I do like including a bi character. Another stereotype that I very intentionally tried to kind of reverse or kind of like play with was asexual characters. Asexual buckaroos in general are very much stereotyped as kind of quiet and reserved and like not really taking up space. And I would say bi characters are always this kind of like wild, manic bi, high energy, very like hypersexual characters. And in general, those stereotypes are pretty ingrained. And so I very intentionally kind of wanted to flip them for Tara and Zeke in Bury Your Gays, where Zeke is kind of the rock who is everything, what I write with when I characterize buckaroos, I do their themes, kind of like what they represent, whether that's a word or a physical object. And Zeke is just like a rock. He is solid and kind of quiet and stoic, and everything thematically with him is sort of like just sturdiness. Which I think generally would be projected on the asexual character. And then Tara is entirely about being vibrant and loud and taking up space. And then kind of part of the narrative is that as an asexual character, even though everything about Tara is loud, that is kind of like, that is just what she represents. That loudness is kind of, no matter how loud she is kind of culturally ignored. And so that plays into the story as well. So that was another thing where the stereotypes of kind of bi-ness and asexuality, I wanted to turn around a little bit and investigate.
Yeah, the characterization and all of their dynamics are really nuanced. And I think just the three of them as a unit is a really sort of like a really nuanced and realistic friendship too. I think even as like, Zeke and Tara are sort of like brought together by this circumstance that is like sort of outside their control. To take a little bit of a shift, because I do have a question about Misha's creative output. I would love to see every single movie and show that he wrote. They all sound really, really lovely.
Yes.
When you as an artist are writing works, like you can only be so conscious of like what your oeuvre is going to mean over time. But if you're writing another person's body of work, you can kind of decide what that oeuvre is going to stand for or mean. So like what went into crafting Misha's like creative output for you?
That's a great question. Originally when I wrote it and knowing what it was going to be about, I thought, well, gosh, if I'm going to do this right, I better kind of write an IMDb for Misha, just to kind of whether I use it or not. And that was kind of part of the plan. But then it evolved from there, because as stories do, you get these ideas and then they kind of spread out and you have different things that kind of need to mean different things. I think really in crafting that, it was I have a lot of personal ideas and personal influences that I've kind of wanted to draw on. So some of these were things that I kind of always wanted to write, or different things that hadn't fit in different places. Some of them were very much a sort of like a noticing something in culture that kind of like hasn't been done or is repeated in these certain patterns. And then I really didn't, I intentionally kind of didn't strip back the influences. A lot of times creators will be influenced by something and then really shave off all of the original, like get rid of those dang serial numbers. And I kind of intentionally didn't in this, because I thought thematically it's a lot more fun if you can kind of see, for instance, the character of the smoker is definitely not the cigarette smoking man from the X-Files in any way, really. But just like having that imagery, there's these little things that kind of just like ping pong in your brain that create this kind of immersive, nostalgic experience where you think that would be a thing. There's an episode where they talk about Dark Encounters, where they investigate the mole people, and I thought that that wasn't an actual X-Files episode, but it absolutely would be. So there's just kind of all of these little things that I thought, okay, I'm just going to take these ideas of like the way that these things repeat. I will also say, interestingly, originally, I don't want to spoil too much, so I won't explain some of the other things, but originally Misha was only supposed to have 3 creations that came after him because of a thematic idea I had, which is in my own personal exploration of myself and my autism and therapy and stuff, there was a lot of reference to the Freudian ego, superego, and id. I don't know. Do you know what those? I can explain that. Maybe I should for listeners, even if you do.
For listeners, it would be great. Yes.
Yeah, so it is essentially there is the superego, which is everyone's personality. And I should preface this by saying that Freud, a lot of this stuff is just, we know now, pretty dang silly, but it does really offer kind of like a framework to talk about it. And so that's kind of how I use it. I use it internally to kind of think about myself. But there is the superego in a personality. Superego is kind of the disciplinarian. It's the one that follows all the rules, is very strict. It's the thing that the part of your personality that tells you like, oh, you got to get up and go because you're going to be late to work, or just like the regulatory part of you. There's the ego that is kind of the central you. A lot of the time we think about it as being self-centered. It doesn't have to be. And then there's the id, which is sort of the more like primal or animalistic part of you, the one that maybe drinks too much or gambles, or the sexual part of you. It's kind of like that part of you, and that none of these things are bad, and that a healthy, balanced person is actually kind of an even amount of all 3 of those working in harmony. So I understood that because I, as an autistic buckaroo who's very logical and regimented, I have a very my super ego for years basically crushed everything else. It was all discipline. It was all working on things, organization, and all these different things that gave me a lot of stress that I'd hold in my body. So for Barrier Gaze, because it's so personal, I thought, okay, well, I want there to be 3 monsters. They represent the ego, superego, and id, and 3 characters that represent superego, ego, and id, because this is all kind of in my head. So for Misha is the ego, and that kind of plays out in kind of like being very centered on himself, and he's the main character, so that kind of makes sense. The super ego would be Zeke, and then the id would be Tara. And then in the monsters, there is the smoker is the ego, the Mrs. Y is the super ego, which is kind of all this discipline and these rules and this kind of higher knowledge. And then Black Lamb would be the id, which is just kind of this primal animal thing. So originally those were the 3 monsters, and then as the story evolved, I realized, okay, there's these other things I need to add and different things here and there, and it's just too darn fun to leave it at 3, to be honest. So more came in, but I still think of those as kind of the central themes of it, and that was really what that development grew out of.
That is so interesting.
Oh my goodness. Yes. I love it.
I'm sorry. I just went off on that one. I apologize for my long-winded art rants.
I love it.
Actually, I think it really makes sense because, where we grew up learning about that stuff, I think a lot of folks are so it's like they're so past Freud. We're on to new things.
Yes.
He's not lurking in the corner.
Well, as they should be, to be honest. It's a very silly thing. I mean, and I guess in that field, I understand you kind of respect these foundations or whatever. The reason that it resonates for me is entirely because I just have a personal experience with my autism when the therapist when I was younger that kind of we worked through this. That was the framework. And even my therapist then said, this is kind of dang baloney, but it's easy to talk about. So let's use these to talk about it. So it has just, it's such a big part of the way I see things that I thought, okay, in Bury Your Gays, every single element of this should be like a deeply personal view into myself and my life, which is, you know, it's a scary book to write, but it also, you know, yeah, I have enough books. No, I don't know how many Buckaroos are going to see this one and think, oh, that's all Chuck right there. It's okay because it's true, but you know.
Wow. I'm just like now thinking, you know, about what you were saying about the super ego and how that does, as you were saying, sort of play into having to mask who you are. And then also how that plays into living a closeted life and how you were also sort of giving the super ego the reins and sort of, you know, I feel like there's just so many interesting conjunctions here. And
Oh, yes.
Very interesting diary entry tonight.
It's honestly, I am, even though it, you know, it's hard. It's an interesting thing to deal with because all of these things are like, yes, having a really overdeveloped super ego has made my life difficult in some ways, but it also makes me who I am. So like I don't dislike it. That's the difficult thing, is I know that kind of the engine runs better with all three in balance. But the reason I can write these hundreds and hundreds of Tinglers is because of this, you know, disciplinary super ego, all these things. Like I said, I think it's a big part of my autism and all these different things of just you know, all that. And then at the same time, the bad thing is, I've talked about this a bit before, but you know, I used to have this chronic pain that was from my body clenching so tight. All my muscles were so tight for so long. I had to go to the dang ER. No one can figure out what it was. And it was from neurotypically masking. And it was from my super ego, all of this regimented discipline. It was so overdeveloped that if anything was off, my whole body would just kind of seize up tight and turn into this rock. So I had to loosen that up, and in that ways, the overdeveloped super ego has been a terrible thing, you know. But it's just all part of trotting on this thing life of ours, you know. That this is all we can kind of do.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think like my real last question, and maybe it's a two-parter, is Camp Damascus and Bury Your Gays, are they connected at all? And when can we see the Netflix original of the Tingle anthology? Because I would watch both of these things all the time.
I will say, here's a little secret that Buckaroos don't notice. The events, because I kind of wrote them at the same time, not only is Camp Damascus mentioned in Bury Your Gays, but Bury Your Gays is mentioned in Camp Damascus. There is when
oh my gosh, yes.
when Rose is in the hospital, she is flipping through the channels and sees Mrs. Y, sees an episode of Dark Encounters. And there's a whole scene where I described this scene, and if you read it, you would think, oh, that just sounds like a scary scene. Once you read, there it is. Also, something else she sees on the channel has to do with Bury Your Gays as well, actually. So she before she hits the one that kind of involves the story, she flips through two channels. I will also say that there is something in Camp Damascus that is directly related to my next book. My next horror novel, that something is mentioned that is connected, and there's a lot of stuff in Bury Your Gays that actually connects to even future ones. I think generally what tends to happen, because I plan so far ahead and I write so much, is that my you know, you have a copy editor, you send it in and they go through, and it's really nice, but they go through things and say, okay, yes, I checked, this business is on this street in this town, and you say that this fact, and yes, this airplane holds this many passengers. They basically just check everything you say so you can write. And I always get things from copy editors that say, well, this TV show doesn't exist, or this song doesn't exist, or this place doesn't exist. Double check. And I also have to be like, that will exist in 3 years when the book comes out and everyone realizes that it was referencing that. So I have lots of Easter eggs in both Camp Damascus and Bury Your Gays about kind of future things.
That is so exciting. And
Oh
I
my
am
goodness.
so excited for this glimpse into, what already exists of the, extended universe of these novels and what comes. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
coming
this
and
was
talking
wonderful.
about this.
So
And
great.
especially,
Oh, thank you for having me. I am so excited to be back. I hope that this can be, our little every time when I put out the next thing, horror novel, this will be the stop, and it will going.
I mean, I don't know about Jen, but we must all be living in each other's brains, because that is what I was going to ask. I was going to be like, so can we make it
That's right,
can we already schedule you for next year?
Put it on the calendar for next. We'll take a date and just copy it for each year in the calendar.
Excellent.
Yes.
Oh, very
thank
cool.
you.
All right.
You want to take a sip?
Sure. So listeners, Bury Your Gaze is awesome. Definitely check it out at your local library, at wherever you get your books, your bookstore. You are going to want to read it. It is fabulous. If you have not checked out Camp Damascus, please do so. It is also fabulous. So this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My co-host was
Jen, thank you so much for having me. If I can just add, every time I have read a Chuck Tingle book, I have learned something new, not about just the world, but about myself. And it's a beautiful experience. Thank you.
Yes, agreed.
Keep going.
Oh, so kind.
All right. And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.